Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Baseball pitchers are always looking for an edge, especially when it comes to today's game where baseball stadiums can barely hold long fly balls. Batters are hitting home runs at an incredible rate. There was a time, however, when pitchers ruled the roost. They pitched inside, the mound was higher than it is today, and all sorts of pitches, including the spitball, were allowed to be thrown. However, in 1920, the spitball was outlawed, but each team was allowed to designate 2 pitchers who would be allowed to use it legally until said pitchers retired from the game. The last man standing was Burleigh Grimes, and when he retired after the 1934 season, the spitball was no longer legally allowed in the game of baseball. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back at the terrific career of Baseball Hall of Famer Burleigh Grimes.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you can join us as we take a look back at some of sports' forgotten heroes. And today, a familiar name to many, but still, a name of which many might not know much about when it comes to his career, Burleigh Grimes. A terrific pitcher who played for the likes of the Pittsburgh Pirates, Brooklyn Dodgers, St. Louis Cardinals, and several other teams as well. Grimes was one of the game's better spitball pitchers, was allowed to keep throwing it after the pitch was outlawed in 1920. But baseball instituted a grandfather clause and allowed 2 players per team who threw the spitball to continue throwing the pitch even though it had been outlawed. And Grimes, well, he took full advantage of it, winning 270 games during his 19-year career, which eventually took him to Cooperstown, New York, and the Baseball Hall of Fame. Joining us on this edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes will be Joe Niese. Now, Joe might be familiar to some of you as he was our guest on episode 43, where we discussed the terrific football career of Gus DeRay. Joe wrote a terrific book about Grimes, Burleigh Grimes, baseball's last legal spitballer, and he'll be here as we'll go in depth about a guy who pitched 300 innings a year, would throw 30-plus complete games a year, and had a demeanor that earned the reputation as one of baseball's fiercest competitors. Before we get there, however, just a few reminders. You can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Check out our Instagram, Sports Forgotten Heroes. Look for our page on Facebook or check out our website, sportsfh.com. This is where you can discover more about the forgotten heroes we talk about. Learn more about our guests, see who else we have on the docket for future episodes, and it's where you can send us questions, comments, or suggest forgotten heroes of your own for future episodes. Again, that's sportsfh.com. Now, let's turn our attention to Burleigh Grimes with our guest, Joe Niese. Joe, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Warren. Good to speak with you again.
Awesome. Today we're going to talk baseball instead of football, and we're going to talk about Burleigh Grimes. So I guess my first question is, what interests you so much that you wanted to write a book about Burleigh Grimes?
My interest came from that his first professional stop in baseball was in my hometown, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And so that's where I really got rolling with it. I had kind of considered doing a longer, 6,000, 8,000 word article on him. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized that, he'd be a great subject for a book.
Sure. What a fascinating story. And, I think we need to start with the spitball. That Burleigh was the last pitcher allowed to throw a spitball in the major leagues legally. So why don't we start with that? Why don't you educate our listeners a little on exactly what a spitball is? I mean, it's not as if you just spit on the ball and throw it. It's a lot more intricate than that.
Yes, yeah, and that's what Grimes always said. He could teach someone in a few minutes, but took years to master. And Grimes had seen it. Oh boy, I can't remember if he was 9 or 10 years old. He saw a pitcher throwing it over in Minneapolis for the Millers, and he was kind of taken with it. And Grimes, he didn't chew tobacco or anything like that. He actually chewed the bark of a slippery elm tree, and that's how he got the lubricant to throw his spitball. And it's like you said, it's a very intricate pitch, and so it's hand placement. And Grimes threw it. He likened it to squeezing a watermelon seed. A lot of pressure put on his nails, so he kind of needed those finely manicured. And it was his out pitch. I don't think he threw it as much as you would think, but pretty much between every pitch, he was putting his glove and his hand up to his mouth to kind of give the batter, get in the batter's head that, is he going to throw it this time or not?
What kind of effect on the ball did such a substance have? I mean, you even wrote that at first it can look like a knuckleball.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what kind of that force that he threw it with, that squeezing out initially kind of had that freezing of a knuckleball, and then it would dart or dive depending on finger placement and how it was thrown.
Mm-hmm. Again, tell us a little bit about the substance that he used and how, I don't know if it was difficult to get, but it surely wasn't handy.
Yes, yeah. So it's pretty, of what I gather, was a pretty abundant here in Wisconsin. When he was growing up, he got the fresh stuff, the slippery elm. When he got to the majors, he kind of had to work with what he could, and he got it out of medicine stores. It's used for stomach ailments. And kind of the funny thing is that he would get sick from it as well. And so he whenever he could, he'd have his dad ship him a fresh batch, or when he was in the World Series, his dad came down to St. Louis and brought him some fresh slippery elm from western Wisconsin to help him with his pitching.
Mm-hmm. Why was he allowed to continue throwing the spitball after it was outlawed?
Yeah, so it started when he was with the Pirates, actually. That was the first team he was with. He was with 7 teams, a rarity at that time, the early decades of the 1900s for someone to hop from team to team. And so Barney Dreyfuss was the Pirates owner, and he was making a motion to do away with all the trick pitches, and spitballs were lumped into that, shine balls, and people were scuffing up the ball with bottle caps and all this stuff. And so Dreyfuss was making this movement to do away with those pitches, and the spitball was lumped into it. And so that kind of led to him being traded. He didn't want to be sent to the minor leagues, as Dreyfuss encouraged him to in 1917, to go down to the minors and learn a different pitch. And so he was traded over to Brooklyn, and a couple of years later, Dreyfuss had finally gotten the other owners to go through with this. And so before the 1920 season, they said each team can allot 2 pitchers to throw the spitball for the duration of the 20 season, and then after that, you had to do something else. And so they went through the 20 season, and Grimes ended up leading Brooklyn to the World Series against Cleveland Indians, and Grimes was Brooklyn's top pitcher. Stan Kovaleski was the Indians' top pitcher, and they're both spitballers. And so the spitball kind of took center stage of the World Series. Brooklyn lost to Cleveland. But after that, the owners kind of stepped back and made a little amendment there, and they said, okay, each team can allot 2 pitchers to use the spitball for the duration of their career. And some teams like Pittsburgh, Dreyfus was the owner of, they didn't nominate anyone, but Brooklyn did nominate 2 people. Grimes was one of them, and when he retired in 1934, he was the last of the legal spitballers.
If Grimes had been, I don't know if you know the answer to this, if Grimes had been traded to a team that already had 2 guys designated that could throw the spitball, would Grimes, or I guess would the team be allowed to have 3 guys throw the spitball? I don't know if you know the answer to that.
Ooh, that's a good question, Warren. I haven't thought of that before. I think that Grimes was he had started to really take a turn in 18, had a really good season for Brooklyn. 19 was cut short because of an injury. In 20, he was, of course, Brooklyn's best pitcher. So, I don't know if he was on another team and there were 2 better spitballers than him, what would have come of it? He probably would have argued his way to another team, maybe, and gotten their nomination.
Let's go back to the beginning. Burleigh's introduction to baseball isn't that different than it is for many youngsters, I guess. He played on highly competitive traveling teams. The only difference is, at least the way I read it in your book, is that these teams had huge followings. So tell us about how the youth teams that Burleigh played on and how big the crowds were that came out to see them play.
Yeah, there was such interest in baseball that they had formed a team for 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds that Grimes was on, which I gather might have been a rarity at the time, in the early 1900s there, for that first decade, for a team of 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds to have a huge following. And they had as big a following as the town team that his dad coached. And Burleigh was a pitcher on those teams, and they traveled to areas, and there was hundreds of people that were watching, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds play. And Grimes eventually ended up playing a couple years of high school ball. He dropped out of high school after his sophomore year because his dad needed him on the farm, and he would have had to transfer to a school where there was a large, pretty lengthy commute. And then he ended up throwing for for Clear Lake. He's from Clear Lake, Wisconsin, for the town ball team there that his dad managed. Started on that when he was 15 years old.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like you sort of just alluded to, he knew that playing baseball and earning a living as a ball player was a lot better than going into the family business. So tell us a little bit about his family and farming and lumberjacking, and then the importance of baseball.
Yes, yeah, baseball was a huge part of the Grimes family. Their day job was farming. When Burleigh retired, or when he dropped out of high school, he started working as a lumberjack in the winters. And so, but baseball was always a huge part of the family for Nick, his dad, and Burleigh, and his brother Shirley as well, who some say was a better pitcher than Burleigh. I don't know if that's true or not. I think sometimes people like to say that stuff, but Shirley was a pretty big guy, was substantially larger than Burleigh was, and pitched a couple years in minor league ball on the East Coast, actually.
Mm-hmm. And Shirley, very interesting spelling to his name, just like Burleigh is a very interesting name. What is the derivation of Burleigh? Where does such a name come from?
Oh, if I remember correctly, it was his mom was into reading about royalty, English royalty, and Lord Burleigh was one of the people that she was reading about when around the time that Burleigh was born, and that's where he got his name from.
So he wanted to play professionally, and he had to actually talk his way onto some minor league ball clubs. Can you tell us anything about his journey through the minors, places like Chattanooga and Birmingham, and then how he was finally discovered.
Sure, yeah. And so he, in 1911, he had gone to Minneapolis, talked to Mike Kelly, manager of the Minneapolis Millers at that time. And he'd sent Burleigh home, and then Burleigh came back the next year, and Kelly once again turned him away and said, there's actually a team in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the Minnesota-Wisconsin League. Russ Bailey's their manager. Why don't you go down there and try out? And so Burleigh went over to Eau Claire and tried out and didn't make the team initially. And so he kind of begged his way with Bailey and said, can I at least be a part of the team in some way? And so Burleigh started out as kind of a manager of some sort, equipment manager, shagging balls, shining shoes. And so he accompanied them on their first road trip to Rochester, I think it was, Minnesota. And for a turn of events, Burleigh needed to get into the game. There was an injury, and I think someone was ejected. And so Burleigh ended up getting into this game and ended up pitching at some point. And so the manager came to him and said, "Hey, we'll offer you a contract." And Burleigh accepted. Instead of taking a weekly payment, he took a monthly payment. Before the month had expired, the league had folded, and Burleigh had no money.
Interesting.
And so he was kind of spent the last 2 months, have nothing to show for it. And so Bailey said, "Hey, I know there's a July 4th doubleheader coming up in Austin, Minnesota, and they need a pitcher. I'll pay your way over there, see what happens." And so Burleigh goes over there, wins his mound start, and then ends up playing the outfield. Burleigh was a very good hitter as well, and ends up having some key hits. And as he's going to the train station, the people who run the team say, "Hey, if you want to sign with us for the rest of the season, you can run the pool hall when we're not playing ball." So Burleigh helps them to the Southern Minnesota League title, and he gets a few eyeballs on him from that. He ends up going to Ottumwa, Iowa the next year, has a real fast start there, wins his first 5 or 6 decisions. Some from the Tigers, a few teams have caught on to him, and the Tigers send him to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Plays for the Chattanooga Lookouts there. And so that's where kind of the start of who his on-field persona is. Up until this point, he'd kind of been, I'd actually read things, game descriptions where he played ball with a big smile on his face, and that kind of changed when he played under Kid Elberfeld, a former major leaguer with Chattanooga. Mm-hmm. And so he has a so-so season there. He goes home, and the next year he actually, in the off season, he almost dies in a lumbering accident. He was driving a load of lumber down a hill, an embankment, and hits a stump that was covered in snow. And this load of lumber comes rolling at him, and he's able to get off of the sled in time, but he breaks his left arm, his non-throwing arm, and that's enough to it happened in February, and he needed to be, in the South there a couple weeks later. And it was enough to kind of impede his progress. And in 1914, he ends up going to a lower league, the Virginia State League, and ends up actually leading his team in wins and as well as batting, and wins the batting title too. And so
wow.
He plays well enough, and then Birmingham Barons signed him in 1915. Thinks he's going to get called up, and he gets in this big fight in 15, and in August he gets suspended, so he doesn't get called up in September. Goes back to Birmingham in 16, finally gets called up by the Pirates in September, and he's off and running in his career from there.
How did he end up with the Pirates? Because it was the Tigers, I thought, that grabbed him first, but then the lumberjacking accident happened. So did the Tigers give up on him too soon? And how did he end up with Pittsburgh?
Well, he had some during spring training. Birmingham had played against the Pirates, and there was some association with Birmingham there. And so the Pirates had kept an eye on him, and Honus Wagner, of all people, had said, you got to keep an eye on this kid. He's going to do something. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, he's playing with Pittsburgh.
Yeah, so he starts his career with the Pirates, and Unfortunately, this was just as the Pirates were transitioning from one of baseball's best to one of baseball's worst. Even the great Honus Wagner, he was no longer playing like Honus Wagner. And even though he pitched pretty well, Grimes' record didn't reflect that, especially his second and last year with Pittsburgh when he went 3-16. And I find that simply remarkable that a guy who goes 3-16 ends up in the Hall of Fame. How bad were those Pirate teams? And tell us about his relationship with his last manager with Pittsburgh, Hugo Bedzik, who, by the way, never played baseball.
Yeah, Bedzik. It was really an abysmal season. He had that real good start in 16, and they kind of thought he was going to be a cornerstone to the staff, along with left-hander Wilbur Cooper. And 17 was just a horrible year for the Pirates. They went through like 3 different managers, including Wagner, who lasted all of 3 or 4 games as manager mid-season before Bedzik took over. And Bedzik was a former football player for University of Chicago. And so Grimes, as you said, just had a horrible season. He lost 13 games in a row at one point. And there was a train ride where Grimes was kind of complaining about his place on the team despite losing 13 games in a row, and Bedzik overheard this. And Grimes, who was about 5'10", $190, and Bedzik was well over 6 feet. Had at least 50 pounds on Grimes. That didn't stop Grimes from picking a fight with Bedzik, and they had this big knockdown, drag-out fight on the train. And Grimes held his own against Bedzik, and he did end up getting to pitch a few more games, which didn't go well for Grimes. It bled over into the next season when I think he lost 16, 17 in a row, total between the 2 seasons. But, as I had mentioned earlier, his owner, Dreyfus, the Pirates owner, called him in there and said that at season's end, hey, you need to learn a different pitch. And Grimes refused, and he ended up being traded to Brooklyn for, amongst other people, Casey Stengel.
And after he's traded to Brooklyn, even Bedzik said that Brooklyn was getting a heck of a pitcher as long as he could contain his temper.
Yep, that's something that kind of plagued Grimes throughout his career. His temper did get the best of him. And as I said, when you're going to 7 different teams at that point in baseball history, something's going on there.
Now, some said he was a throw-in to the trade that took him from Pittsburgh to Brooklyn. But I think his 19-9 record said otherwise. Talk about that first year with Brooklyn. While he went 19-9, it certainly wasn't a smooth season for anyone, mostly because of the World War. Yeah,
and Brooklyn, who were then, a bunch of different names. Robbins is what I think I refer to them most after their manager, Wilbert Robinson. Yeah, it was a heck of a season for them, and they were one of the most hard hit by World War I. And Grimes, who served in the Navy Reserve at some point in July, I think, of that year, him and Rue Marquardt were in Chicago, and they ended up signing up for the Naval Reserves. Grimes was the most consistent pitcher for them at that season, and it didn't start out that well, though. He was still couldn't find his way with the spitball. Robinson, who was renowned as a person who worked with pitchers, a former catcher, Wilbert Robinson was, kind of worked on him with the nickel curve, or the slider, nickel curve as it was called then. And that kind of added to Grimes' repertoire. He finally found his way with the spitball. And he was going to be cut, actually, in spring training, and Robinson spoke up on his behalf, and kind of the rest is history with that season.
I didn't know that they were the Dodgers and then became the Robins before becoming the Dodgers again.
Yeah.
Why did they call themselves the Robins? I get it that their manager, his last name was Robinson, but why name the team after him? Enlighten us a little there.
Oh, it was kind of a tradition in Brooklyn. There was their previous manager. They seemed to name them after, give them alternate nicknames having to do with their manager, and for whatever reason, the Robins stuck, and they referred to them on and off for a number of years after that, until finally becoming the Dodgers and full time in the 30s, I think, 40s.
So Burleigh's second season in Brooklyn ended somewhat prematurely, but before we get to the reason why, first, talk about the term you used when describing Burleigh, ferocious. He really didn't like that, did he?
No, I as combative as a person he was, it was kind of an on-field persona at times. And I think he played into that too. He liked to play into that. Amongst other things, he always had a 5 o'clock shadow when he pitched, and some people thought that was kind of to be part of intimidation, but it was actually because of the slippery elm that irritated his skin so much. He needed a little barrier there. But he liked to intimidate people, and that was part of his game plan.
Like you said, he liked to intimidate people. He was ferocious on the mound. And that demeanor ultimately led to, I guess, an ugly incident with Frankie Frisch, and that ended Burleigh's season. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. Grimes had been pitching Frisch inside quite a bit, and there was a play at first base where Grimes was covering, and Frisch took to Burleigh's ankle there, and nearly severed Grimes' Achilles tendon, ending his 1919 season a little bit early.
And what about his ferociousness? Did that stick with him throughout his career? And if so, how did it affect his game? Did it help him? Did it hurt him? Talk about that a little bit more. His demeanor on the mound. I think like any player that has, their emotions like that, it can help at times, but it also hurt. And by the time Grimes was out of Brooklyn in 26, there was very few teammates that he associated with, even he fought with, as I say, fans, umpires, opponents, his own team, and his demeanor helped him at times, but I think it hurt him as well. So, was he that way away from the game?
He was. I spoke with some members of the Minneapolis Sabre group, and they were one of the last groups to meet with Burleigh before he passed away in December of '85. And they said he was getting, they went and saw him, I think, the summer before he passed, and he was just as animated as ever. He was swearing about some ball player, and, so I don't think he ever lost his edge there.
He pitched over 300 innings 5 times in his career. Of course, today we marvel at a guy who pitches over 200 innings. I loved Burleigh's response to your question to him about pitching 300 innings a year. He said that was nothing compared to the guys who pitched before him and would throw 400 innings a year. I mean, the game was different then. Talk about that. Complete games. You were expected to pitch complete games, and sometimes not only did he pitch a complete game, he would pitch 15, 16, 17 innings. I mean, the thought of that today is mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Looking at some of his complete games he pitched, in 21 he threw 30 complete games, 23, 30, 24, 30. It's crazy. And I always, it's kind of, I of course I get the question, do I think he was a Hall of Famer? And you look at his stats in the 20s, and it's just, they're mind-boggling, the amount of games he threw and innings he pitched, and it's crazy the amount of games he started and finished.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the 1920 season for a moment. I think even though he won 23 games, it had to be one of the most disappointing of his career. Is he and the Robins lost to the Cleveland Indians in the World Series. In fact, in your book, you said that Grimes was still bitter about the series decades later. And Charles Ebbets, owner of the Robins or the Dodgers, also played a role in giving Cleveland an advantage in the series. What happened?
Well, if I jog my memory correctly, did they start the game they started the series in Cleveland, if I'm correct. They moved it there. And they also, that was the year that Ray Chapman was killed. Cleveland shortstop was killed by a pitch. And so Ebbets had let, was it Sewell, I think? I can't remember their shortstop's name now, Cleveland shortstop. But they let a guy play for them that maybe shouldn't have eligibility-wise, and then they started the series in Cleveland as well when they could have started it in Brooklyn, giving Cleveland an advantage.
And didn't Burleigh overhear, or was he asked a question many years later about the series, and like the guys who asked him the question didn't know that was Burleigh Grimes? I mean, talk about that.
Yes, that's a wonderful story, isn't it? Yeah, about it was decades later in probably the 70s. You know, half a century later, he's fishing in northern Wisconsin, and there happens to be a trivia question up on the board there in the bait shop that he goes into about who gave up the first Grand Slam in World Series history. And the guys, see Burleigh in there and they're like, oh, he'll know who it was, not knowing that he was the one who gave up the Grand Slam. And so they ask him, and he says, one Burleigh A. Grimes, and just exits the shop without seeing their reaction.
What kind of person was Burleigh Grimes? I mean, we talked about how he was a ferocious person on the field. Was he an honest person? Was he a good person? How would you characterize him?
Of what I gather, he was. There were some incidents where, in business dealings, he made money in oil in Ohio and had a large farm in Missouri, and you're not always going to make people happy when you're in business dealings. I was fortunate enough to work closely with a man by the name of Charles Clark, who in Burleigh's hometown at Clear Lake, who was kind of the son that Burleigh never had. Him and Chuck's wife Ardith, Burleigh really took to them, and so I worked closely with Chuck on the book with him, and so I got a lot of insights into Burleigh. Of course, positive recollections from Chuck, but of what I gather, your professional athletes are competitive people, whether it's on the field or off the field, and so that bleeds into business dealings sometimes. But of what I gather, he was a decent man. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask that is because of the issues surrounding the barnstorming trip to Cuba.
Yes. Yeah, with the money.
Yeah.
And so and after the 21 season, Grimes led a barnstorming tour, and probably the biggest thing that really irked his teammates was they went back to Austin, Minnesota for a kind of a welcome home for Burleigh, and there was he got a really big welcome home, and his wife got some stuff, and they took this huge person, and his teammates thought that he took too much of it and didn't get enough to them. And so, yeah, like I said, that kind of plays into the whole, by the time he was done in Brooklyn, he didn't, a lot of his teammates weren't too sad to see him leave.
And some of that also stems from the fact that he'd fight with his own teammates and show a lot of emotion on the field and confront them if they made errors behind him. Was he the only guy that did this? I mean, talk about how the game, and how personalities were different back then than they are today.
Yeah, I don't know how common that was to just openly confront a teammate in the middle of a game about a poor play, but Grimes wasn't afraid to do it. That's for sure. And one of the biggest people that took the brunt of actions was his catcher, Otto Miller. And, those two weren't really on speaking terms by the end. And Grimes actually ended up having to have a personal catcher at one point. So, yeah, I don't know how frequent it was for other people to openly confront teammates on the field, but Grimes wasn't afraid to do it.
He also had the habit of holding out before a season would begin until he got the dollars he wanted, and he also had a habit of getting off to slow starts. Could you expand on both?
Yeah, so of course there weren't agents back then, and there was rarely multi-year contracts. So every year you had to renegotiate contracts. And Grimes, who was wealthy off the field, like I said, had business investments, he was able to kind of dangle that in front of Brooklyn, in front of Ebbets, Charles Ebbets in particular. And so, it seemed like almost every year that he was doing some sort of, he was holding out or report late. And I think that kind of affected his early start, his poor or slow starts to the season.
He also had a lot of injuries and a lot of ailments. A broken thumb, the torn Achilles, constant battles with the flu, or he had appendicitis. The list goes on and on. Was there ever an explanation as to why he was always battling something? And, it looks like it lasted his whole career. Did he not take care of himself? What was going on here?
I don't know if because he wasn't a drinker or a smoker or anything of substance during his career, and he smoked cigars afterwards and probably smoked them a little bit while he played. But I don't know. He kept very good care of himself, physically. But yeah, it just seemed like there was always something popping up that, and I don't know if that was at the time, just health at the time, but for the stuff that happened to him, to have the career he had is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, when I look back, the one guy who comes to mind, obviously a much different pitcher, but one of the guys that comes to mind when I look at Grimes' career record is Nolan Ryan. And the reason I say that is because Grimes would win 23 games and lose 19 games. That's sort of like what Nolan Ryan did when he was with the Angels. He would win 24 games, lose 20, win 22, lose 21. I don't think there are a lot of pitchers around that would have nearly as many losses in a 20-win season as a guy like Grimes or later Nolan Ryan. Now, some of Grimes' struggles and some of the reasons he had so many losses was because, sometimes it was the team that he played for. They just weren't that good. But it was also because of the slow starts. And part of the slow starts, I think, had to be attributed to the fact that he had a habit of tipping off pitches. Can you explain some of what he did to tip off pitches?
Yeah, that's a good one. Probably the best one is the ball cap one, where he, whenever he would, Art Fletcher, I think, of the Phillies, who had a real bad team at the time, but they just killed Grimes, and he finally, I think it was a bat boy that finally realized that they were noticing every time he was throwing the spitball, he would move his jaw, and this ball cap was too tight, so his cap would wiggle. And they would see this, and they would know that the spitball was coming. And so once he realized that was the case, he got a little looser hat, and that changed things for him, fortunately.
That's amazing that something like that can actually tip off a batter.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the holdouts. How did his habit of holding out, or did his habit of holding out, ultimately help launch the career of Dazzy Vance, another Hall of Famer?
Yeah, that was the 22 season, if I remember correctly, when Vance came to when came to Brooklyn. So Robinson was looking for more pitchers, and Grimes had held out, and Vance got a chance, and over the next couple of years, they really had a strong 1-2 pitching combination for Brooklyn, and kind of culminating in a mythical 24 season where, despite not winning the pennant, it was right down to the last couple of games. And it was led by Grimes and Vance and Bill Doak, another spitballer.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain, I think Grimes came about during the transition from the dead ball era to the lively ball era. Can you explain the difference between the two, and perhaps how baseball addressed putting more offense into the game?
Sure, and so that kind of ties into that 1920 season, where when they were trying to do away with trick pitches, they also decided to use more baseballs in a game. Now there's dozens of balls in a game, but back then there was just 1 or 2 they would use. And so that's kind of 1920 was when that started, and ironically was they were trying to clean up the game. That was also when Ray Chapman was killed that season as well, when they were doing that. But 20 was kind of the start of the live ball era, so to speak. Babe Ruth was with the Yankees now. Balls started to fly out of the park. There was talk of the ball was changing. A rabbit ball, so to speak, was used. Bats were changing. Larger barrels were being used by players. And so the 1920 season was the beginning of the live ball era. And Grimes performed well. In 1920 he won 23, and 21 he won 22. And so, he's one of the winningest pitchers of that decade.
And teams, the team batting averages were crazy. As much offense as there is in the game today, particularly the long ball, team batting averages back in the 20s, I think, were a lot higher than they are today. There were teams hitting 280. Yeah,
it was crazy. It was, let me look at it here. The 1920, the 22 Brooklyn Robins, they hit, what they hit that year? They hit 290 as a team, and that wasn't even, they were ranked 6th in the league that year.
Oh, man.
It's crazy, yeah.
So in 1923, in this lively ball era, Burleigh goes 21-18. He threw 33 complete games, led the National League in innings pitched with 327, and he had a 3.58 ERA. He said it was his best season ever. Why is that?
I think there's a couple of reasons. He was, I think with the amount of offense that was going on there, and to kind of persevere through that. And I think it was one of the more satisfying seasons for him because of that, because despite all of the offense that was going on, he won 21 games. Yeah, he lost 18, but to be able to be one of the better pitchers in the league at that time was satisfying for him.
So the Dodgers are trying to put together this team to win a World Series, and they just can't do it. And no matter what moves they made, they just couldn't get over the hump. And it seems like they were always looking to trade Burleigh. Finally, Charles Ebbets, who was the owner of the team, passes away, and it appeared as if the relationship between Burleigh and Wilbert Robinson and the Robins or Dodgers seemed to grow more and more contentious. Is that true? It definitely wasn't pleasant.
Oh, you hit the nail on the head there. And so they had that real good season in 24, where they almost won the pennant. But in 25 and 26, Grimes' play starts to slip. He goes 12-19 in 25, 12-13 in 26. And that's, to continually fight about contracts. Brooklyn finds is enough. We're going to trade you. So they end up trading him across town to the New York Giants.
And he was quite happy to be traded to the Giants. But this time, his time with the Giants only lasted 1 year, and he had a decent season. So I'm not understanding, outside of maybe his age, why did he only last with the Giants for 1 year, despite the fact he had a pretty good season?
Well, he had a great season. He loved playing for John McGraw, and he said if he had pitched for McGraw his whole career, he would have easily won over 300 games. He won 270 for his career. And he ended up, I think, winning 13 games in a row at one point for the Giants that year.
Mm-hmm.
But he just couldn't help himself. Once again, he ran himself, kind of wore out his welcome. And that Giants team had, I think, 8 future Hall of Famers on it. And Grimes, just like I said, couldn't help himself. They came to a series late in the season against the Pirates, and he got his teammates to sign this petition to give to McGraw to say that Grimes should pitch this one game. And if you know anything about McGraw, he doesn't want to be told what to do. And so, after that 27 season, he's traded again because of that.
Incredible. A guy who wins 270 games for his career is traded as often as Burleigh Grimes was. And so he lasts the 1 year with the New York Giants, and he ends up back in Pittsburgh with the Pirates. And he goes 25-14 his first year with Pittsburgh, 1928. And then an injury-plagued 1929 season, he went 17-7. He battled thumb injuries. His manager, Donnie Bush, resigned and was replaced by a guy by the name of Jewel Enns. He and Grimes did not get along, and off to Boston he goes. He's traded again. And Grimes plays for the Braves for the 1930 season, but his stay didn't last very long. He was 3-5, and now he's shipped to the Cardinals. Again, here's a guy who is ultimately elected to the Hall of Fame, a guy who won more games in the 1920s, I think, than anyone else. He can't find a home. Joe, what is going on here?
I think, yeah, like I said, he was pretty good at wearing out his welcome. And that 28-29, well, 28 in particular with Pittsburgh, he could have easily won over 30 games if he hadn't hurt his thumb. He still ended up leading the majors with 25 wins, 48 games, 28 complete games, led the entire majors, but wore out his welcome. I always say he was sent to baseball purgatory, the Boston Braves in 1930, and was fortunately at the trading deadline traded to the St. Louis Cardinals and ended up leading them to the World Series that year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't have an explanation for why he was traded so much, but I think it's just pretty obvious. It was his relationship, his inability to get along with people.
Incredible. So, yeah, he goes to St. Louis to finish out the 1930 season, and he goes 13-6, and the Cardinals go to the World Series, but they lose to the Philadelphia Athletics, and Grimes goes 0-2 in the series. Then comes along 1931. He has a decent year, a good year, going 17-9, and once again, the Cardinals play the Athletics in the series. Only this time, the result is much different. And the pain and agony that Burleigh Grimes was going through during this series, from the way you wrote it, it must have been excruciating for him to be out on the mound pitching. Tell us about his time with the Cardinals, particularly the 1931 series, and what was going on with Burleigh Grimes.
So if I remember correctly, he had appendicitis was one of the things, and they were icing him up, and his sternum that he was having issues with as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he, what an effort by him in that series. He went 2-0. including a clinching Game 7 where, like I said, he was just in agony that entire series, and particularly Game 7 in particular, and was having to get iced up every time he went back to the dugout. And, he persevered, and they ended up winning Game 7.
He pitched a 2-hitter with an appendicitis. Unfortunately, he couldn't finish up the game. I mean, he was just toast. I mean, he had nothing left to give, and they had to pull him as the Athletics were making a comeback. But he only gave up 2 hits, and I mean, the perseverance here. The fact that he was able to do this, was his time in St. Louis a good time? Talk about his time with the Cardinals. And ironically, he becomes a teammate of Frankie Frisch. And they wind up building a lifelong friendship after all that had happened between them.
Yeah, those Cardinal team were pretty darn good. And Grimes loved his time there. And being a World Series hero, he thought he was going to kind of ride out the rest of his career with them, and he just missed being part of the Gas House gang. And so he bought this huge acreage of land in Missouri, and he probably ends up getting traded to the Chicago Cubs.
Wow. One of the things you mentioned early on was he was a decent hitter, particularly in the minors, but he was a darn good hitter in the majors. Talk about, throughout all of this, he's winning baseball games as a pitcher, and this guy can hit the ball too. I think there was a couple of years where he might have even hit over 300.
Yeah, in 1920 he hit 306. In 24 he hit 298. In 28 hit 321. So yeah, for his career to be a 248 hitter, in 1,500 at bats to bat 248 as a pitcher is pretty darn good.
After his years, I guess following the World Series, he's now 38, and he starts to really bounce around. He goes to the Cubs, then back to the Cardinals, then the Yankees, then the Pirates again. How effective was he over his final couple of seasons?
Well, it was. Yeah, I don't know if it was that stuff that happened in the World Series, but by 32 when he was with the Cubs and they played in the World Series, of course, Babe Ruth called shot supposedly, which Grimes said never would have happened. He wasn't too effective those last couple of years. As you said, he bounced around the league quite a bit and ended up of all places with the Pirates. Mm-hmm. One last run with them in 34.
Let's go back to Babe Ruth. Grimes said that really didn't happen. I guess Babe Ruth was actually pointing to someone. He really wasn't pointing that he was going to hit a home run. Can you expand on that at all? Do you recall that story?
And, and so I don't know how I phrase it in the book. I've talked to Chuck a little bit about it recently, and so Grimes and one of his teammates, I think Charlie Root, were really giving Ruth a hard time from the bench, and there was 2 strikes on him, and Grimes claimed that he said that he was pointing at him and said, I got one more, the big one coming, said one more. So he's pointing over at Grimes in the Cubs dugout, and that's what he said what happened there. So, of course, there's been a whole book written about that game and that called shot, so...
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's, many different stories about that.
So Burleigh finally calls it quits, and he bounces around as a coach and a manager, in the majors and the minors, and then he finally becomes manager of the Dodgers in 1937 and 1938. He didn't fare too well. Can you talk about the experience that he had as a manager? What kind of manager he was?
Yeah, it was a pretty miserable experience for him. And of all things, his bench coach was Babe Ruth, who was trying to get back in the game. And so Ruth was kind of this pregame attraction, would be hitting home runs, batting practice for the game, and then be asking Grimes if he could play that night. And So it was a pretty miserable experience for Grimes, and after that 38 season, he was fired and never managed in the major leagues again.
How bittersweet was it for him that he's fired and basically, like you said, he never managed in the majors again? What did he do after that?
Well, he surely wasn't done with baseball. He spent the next 3 decades in the game. He bounced around the minors as a coach, a manager. His last job was as a scout for the Baltimore Orioles. He helped develop those great pitching staffs of Baltimore in the late 60s until he finally retired in 71.
Mm-hmm. And before he retired in 71, he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1964. Does anything in particular stand out about his induction?
Yeah, and there was a long time where he really wasn't on the radar to be into the Hall of Fame, and Ty Cobb, towards the end of his life, kind of made it his mission to get certain players that he thought belonged in the Hall of Fame into the Hall of Fame, and Grimes was one of Cobb's favorite players. And so he really pushed for that, and there was some momentum, and he was finally voted in by the Veterans Association in 64.
He won 270 games. He played for such a long time. Is part of that 270 wins a fact of just being around and compiling numbers, or do you think he truly was a Hall of Fame pitcher?
I struggle with this for a long time, and I think that 270 is part of longevity. His last really 2, 3, 4 seasons weren't that great, so he didn't pile on many stats at the end there. But I always go back to his ranking in the 1920s for where he sat statistic wise, and the winningest pitcher of the decade and all that stuff. And I think that first decade of the live ball era and his success really solidifies his Hall of Fame entrance. And there was some discussion of the Veterans Committee. He was getting voted in by his contemporaries, and they were maybe playing some favorites. But I think he was a Hall of Famer.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Joe, in all your research, what surprised you most about Burleigh Grimes?
I think we talked about it a lot here. Just the amount of times he went to different teams. I think, going into it, I always consider myself knowing a lot about baseball, and I started writing seriously, and I realized how little I did know. And so I think the amount of teams he was on, 7 different teams, there's very few Hall of Famers that were on that many teams. Maybe Rickey Henderson is up there. I think I don't know if Henderson was on 9, 10 teams or something like that, but it surprised me how often Grimes bounced around and the success he had with different teams, so.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe, I want to thank you for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, your book, Burleigh Grimes, Baseball's Last Legal Spitballer. If someone wanted to get a copy, where could they go to get one?
Well, if you'd like to order it right from me, you can go to my website, joeniese.com, JOENIESE.com. I'd be happy to autograph a copy and send it off to you. Otherwise, it's on Amazon if you want to go that route, or you can go directly from my publisher, McFarland.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how's your book about Gus Doray doing?
It's going well. Yeah, it's going well. We'll see how things go once football season starts here. That always seems to reinvigorate the market there when that season comes around. And I'm working on a book about Zach Wheat, one of Grimes' teammates right now. And so,
very cool. Well, you'll have to let us know when that book comes out. I think that Zach would make a great topic for Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Yeah, I'm enjoying writing about him. It's another guy where it's like how those names that slip through the crack. I mean, Wheat is still atop most of the batting numbers for the Dodgers franchise, and he's just one of those people that just not many people know about. So I'm enjoying telling his story.
Awesome. Again, Joe, thanks so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and I look forward to having you back again sometime in the future.
Thanks, Warren. Appreciate it. Always enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you. Grimes finished his career the same place he started it, with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Overall, he won 270 games and lost 212 with a career ERA of 3.53. 5 times he won 20-plus games, threw 314 complete games, and recorded 35 shutouts. But it was his demeanor on the field that earned him his reputation as one of baseball's fiercest competitors, a demeanor that helped him win as a player, but not so much as a manager. Grimes tried managing but didn't meet with much success. He was at the helm of the Dodgers for 2 seasons, 1937 and 1938, but neither year ended on the plus side as the Dodgers went 62-91 and followed that with a 69-80 season. Burleigh stayed in the game as a coach and in other capacities afterwards, but he never got the opportunity to manage in the majors again. I'd like to thank our guest, Joe Niese, once again for joining us. His book, Burleigh Grimes, Baseball's Last Legal Spitballer, can be found on Amazon, or you can go to joeniese.com. That's JOENIESE.com to order it there and check out the other books Joe has written as well. I'd also like to thank all of you for listening and to remind you to check us out on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or our website, sportsfh.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.